happiness. Everyone is looking for it, but we look for it in all the wrong places. What if we had a guide that showed us what John Wesley called the complete art of happiness? We do. Join us this fall as we look at the Sermon on the Mount, one sermon that changed the world. Good morning. It's the greatest thing in the world to be a Christian. And we want to say welcome to everyone this morning. We remember that verse in the Bible. It says, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. And let all those who agree with that say amen. 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 When Tony Forcier saw the title for this sermon series behind me, One Sermon That Changed the World, he said, pretty high on your sermons there, aren't you, Nathan? You know we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount. It was 34 years ago that Mr. Keating stood up on his desk and he said, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." And you all think I'm about to fall, don't you? "Oh, Captain, my Captain." It's called rehearsing. "Oh, Captain, my Captain." And we all learned from a movie that it's Walt Whitman who said that. And we tend to think this is the way we're supposed to read the Sermon on the Mount. These mountaintop experiences where you see the whole world anew, and the Sermon on the Mount causes you to be a super Christian. But most of our life is not lived up here. Most of our life is lived in the mundane, in the ordinary, in the average part of life. And I just want you to think about that when we read the Sermon on the Mount, because we enjoy it when someone comes to excite us in our mountaintop moments. But we need something to sustain us in the everyday moments of life. And the text says that one day, as he saw the crowd gathering, he went up on the mountainside and he sat down. Now, why do you think he sat down? You remember that phrase about the Pharisees, that they sit in Moses' seat? That's a metaphor, but it refers back to something very literal. Back in Deuteronomy 9, the text says that Moses went up on the mountain to touch the face of God, and he was there for 40 days. And the rabbis said that he sat on the mountain. So if you're going to dare to speak for God from the mountain, you're sitting in Moses' seat. But on this occasion, Jesus says to every teacher, you're sitting in my seat. For Jesus declares the story of God, because in this moment, God himself comes down to our level. And the most amazing part of it all is that he speaks to us as a friend speaks to a friend. The text says, his disciples gathered around him, and he began to teach them. Welcome to worship. I have a question for all of our students. Why are you really in school? A friend of mine, teaches out at Abilene for several years, had this project, this exercise he would do in class. He'd have his students draw a box on a piece of paper, and he'd say, all right, I want you to write in the box why you are here. Why are you taking my class? Your ultimate reason. And then he'd have the students turn their answers in, and he'd look at them one by one, and the first one would say, because the class is required. Wrong answer, he would say. Next one comes up. Because I need the class to graduate. Closer, but wrong. Over the years he would do this. He said one year he had the right answer. Some student wrote the word boat, which is the right answer, you see, because he was taking the class so he could graduate. He had to graduate so he can get the job he wanted. He needed to get the job he wanted so he can get the money he wanted so he could buy the boat, which is what he really wanted. Right answer. Or is it? What is it that you really, really want? I could ask you to think about, why is it that we go through all the pain, all the difficulties of life? Why do we go through the hustle and bustle of everyday life? What is it that we're really aiming for? Life with a capital L, so to speak. Get your pen and write it down in that top box in your sermon notes. The perfect house, maybe. The perfect car, the perfect job. Maybe some black gold Texas tea. Swimming pools filled with movie stars. Go ahead, write it in the box. The problem is that most things that we put in that box just don't seem to deliver. The wisest man who ever lived, second to Jesus Christ, said, I sought everything under the sun. I tried all those things, and I found that the good life does not consist in having wealth and power, the right job, the right spouse, the right retirement plan, the right vacation. But we know that, don't we? I mean, we know that having the good life is not the same thing as having the right goods. We know that intuitively. But do we live like that? I mean, could it be that what truly leads to the good life is something that isn't on my list, something that I didn't write in the box? I have some bad news for you. If the Lord doesn't come back, you're probably going to die. What do you want people to say about you at your funeral? You know, most of us don't get a preview of that coming attraction. But a gift was given to Alfred. Alfred was a whiz. He had made, through his own mind, his own inventions, ways to blow things up. And he was a self-made millionaire because of it. And he had 355 patents dedicated to the art of war. He had things like nitroglycerin detonators, blasting caps, smokeless gunpowder. And at the age of 34, Alfred invented dynamite, and it put him on the map. He was so wealthy because of it, and it was used profusely in wars all over the world. But then the most curious thing happened. In 1888, when he was 55 years old, Alfred went to his breakfast table and he opened up the newspaper, and as he sipped his coffee, he was stunned to read his own obituary. His brother had had a heart attack in Paris, and due to some really bad journalism, they got the names mixed up. And someone had written an obituary about him, and he was reading it firsthand. And instead of talking about his accolades, the line began this way: "The merchant of death is dead." Can you imagine waking up and reading that? It gets worse. Said he's a man who spent his life and considerable wealth developing new ways to mutilate and to kill. On that day, sitting in his breakfast chair, staring face to face with his own mortality and reputation, Alfred Nobel had a change of heart. He called his lawyer and he said, "Let's change my will." And he wanted to leave all of his money to offering a prize every year to the person in the world who does the most to bring about peace. You know it as the Nobel Peace Prize. What if I asked you to write your own obituary? Curious what you'd write. I imagine when you put pen to paper, whether to write your own obituary or even to write your answer in the box, you too might have a change of heart. You see, we all seem to keep two lists in our minds. On the one hand, we have the things that we go to school for, or that we think we go to school for, the things we think we're trying to achieve in life. Might call them the resume virtues. These are the things that say you're very competitive. You can be cutthroat. You know how to climb the social ladder. The kinds of things you want to use to get the job you want so you can get to the next level on the rung on the ladder. Call them the resume virtues. We have that list in our mind. How you can outmaneuver anybody in this kill or be killed world. But then, somewhere deep in the recesses of our minds, we have another list. We have the list of things we want someone to say about us when we're gone. Call them the eulogy virtues. And I doubt seriously that in that list, you're thinking that they're going to talk about how much money you had in your bank account, or how many people you were able to stab on your way over them up the social ladder. You're hoping they're going to say that you were brave and kind, that you were virtuous and good, that you were faithful, and no one had ever seen a finer friend. But it's telling, isn't it, that somehow it takes us far too long to realize that chasing that first list does not automatically lead to the second list. If you spend your life chasing the resume virtues, why would you ever think that you would achieve the eulogy virtues? No, what you chase is what you become. You see, the list of things that you live for is the list of things your heart craves. Show me what you live for, and I'll show you what you love. And that's why Augustine said, you are what you love. That means the only way that we're going to intentionally move toward the eulogy virtues, toward the obituary that you want written for yourself, is to change the things we love. David Brooks, in his book, The Road to Character, says, we don't become better because we acquire new information. We become better because we acquire better loves. Education is a process of love formation. When you go to school, it should offer you new things to love. That quote is very telling because one early church historian says the problem with all of our church history books is that we are infatuated with the history of ideas. We think church history is the history of good ideas. The problem is all those ideas that are volleyed back and forth over church history was at the service of a much higher and more loftier goal. No. The church gave men and women something new to love. The church gave Jesus Christ, a person who inspired actions and held our affections. The church saw its mission to win hearts and minds, to change lives by changing what we love. Call it the school of Christ. It was Jesus who said, a thief is only there to steal and to kill and destroy, but I came so that they may have real and eternal life, more and better life than you ever dreamed of. Life with a capital L. Progression in the school of Christ involves transformed habits and having new things to love. And in the school of Christ, the curriculum is the Sermon on the Mount. It's designed to aid you in adopting new loves, becoming a transformed self, and experiencing the good and abundant life. The Sermon on the Mount is only 3 chapters long. You can read it before I finish the sermon. And yet that sermon has become known as the sermon. Augustine called it the charter of the Christian life. John Wesley called it the complete art of happiness. Did you know that in the early centuries, the Sermon on the Mount was the textbook for everything in life, in every school? It was the textbook from ethics to parenting. In fact, it was listed as one of the most inspiring texts in the world. The early church fathers quote the Sermon on the Mount more than they quote anything else. Matthew chapter 5 is quoted throughout church history more times than anything else. And it wasn't just loved by Christians. It was called one of the most important texts by Gandhi, who would use it to chastise Christians for not living up to it. It is the most unique sermon that strikes a chord with believers and unbelievers alike. And so it makes me wonder, if the sermon is so good and so rich and so powerful, aimed towards our ultimate end, the good life, the thing we're all searching for, there must be a catch, because the sermon is often highly neglected. John Stott famously said, of all the teachings of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount is probably the best known, arguably the least understood, and certainly the least obeyed. But that makes sense, doesn't it? If it's the least understood, of course it's the least obeyed. I can't tell you how many times I didn't obey something my parents told me because I didn't understand what they were wanting me to do. And if you read the Sermon on the Mount, you just might feel just as confused. If you read Matthew 5 and its parallel in Luke chapter 6, and you read it at face value, you might be in for a shock. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean? Well, Luke just says, blessed are the poor. Blessed are the hungry. Blessed are those who are persecuted. Let's see. Who wants to be blessed? Everybody raises their hand. Okay, who wants to be poor, hungry, and persecuted? Nobody raises their hand. Everybody knows the rule, don't murder. And everyone knows that what happens to you if you do murder. But Jesus says that you and I are guilty of judgment if we have anger in our hearts towards our brother long before it leads to murder. We all know that you're supposed to, protect yourself, defend yourself, keep yourself secure at all costs, and, don't let bad people run the place. And we also know that, you should be really careful about who you give stuff to. And Jesus says, I want you to not resist an evil person. If somebody wants your coat, give them your shirt also. Jesus, can you summarize this new standard of righteousness for me? Sure, says Jesus. Be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And the commentaries are always there to help us out, right? The commentaries say, well, the word perfect really means complete or total, so don't get too worked up. Okay, whatever the word means, the second part of the verse is still there. Whatever it is, be just the way God is that thing. Tough. I've got a simple question for you. Does he mean it? In Christian history, some have argued, no, he doesn't mean it. A really wise, really clever, really smart person in church history said, I think this is supposed to be written to tell you you can't possibly do it, and when you realize you can't possibly do it, you'll praise Jesus for having done it. That's why it's there. Nobody can keep the Sermon on the Mount, but Jesus can. Praise Jesus. Well, listen, I want us to praise Jesus. And I believe nobody can do it like Jesus did. But the end of the Sermon on the Mount ends with this story. Whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them will be like the wise man. Well, okay, maybe he meant for his disciples to do it. I mean, it says his disciples gathered around him. Maybe this is like an apostle's instruction. Well, no, because at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew 28, Jesus says, I want you to go and teach all nations, and I want you to teach them to obey what? Everything that I commanded you. Well, that includes the Sermon on the Mount. I don't think there's any question that Jesus meant it. But there is a question about what he meant by it. I think some have wrongly suggested that Jesus didn't mean it. But others have read it like a daily checklist, like a New Testament Deuteronomy. Do these things, do them right, and then you'll be righteous, you'll be good, you'll be blessed. And when you've done all these things the right way, then you'll be happy and you'll enjoy the good life. Good luck. I think that Jesus isn't doing that. If Jesus is really trying to give us a one-stop shop, rigid set of rules meant to apply directly to every situation, then we ought to think that people deserve to be put in maximum security prisons for harboring anger in their hearts. After all, the judgment facing them is the same as murder. We ought to never practice self-defense. We ought to never serve as a defendant in court. I mean, he says no oaths. That rules out the Pledge of Allegiance or swearing to tell the whole truth. No more Boy Scouts. If Jesus is giving a rigid set of rules to be read legalese, then you ought to never say no to when your kids ask for more money from your wallet. Because it says, don't resist an evil person. Who's more evil? We know in our bones that there's something more challenging than claiming that this only applies to Jesus. But we also know there's got to be something more reassuring than saying we're only pleasing to God when we live perfect lives. Jesus is not giving case law. He's demanding that we get to the heart of the matter that no law could ever fully cover. He doesn't just want us to say, I've come up to the point where I've kept the rule and now I can go do my own thing. He wants us to see that God's always calling us to think differently and to be different. I want to suggest a better way to read than a way that makes you stay up at night wondering if you've done enough to be saved, because the answer is always no. I want to read a better way to read that gives you assurance in the sight of God. Most Christians think that the Sermon on the Mount is primarily about ethical decision-making. What to do, what not to do, and how to do it or not do it. But what if the sermon is less about what to do and more about who you are called to be? The sermon doesn't just inform us. The sermon transforms us. It's about character formation. How do you become the kind of person whose intentions and motivations lead us to want to choose what is good? When we read the sermon, we should be asking ourselves not just, how do I get into heaven? But what kind of person do I need to be when I get there? Not just how do I enter the kingdom of heaven, but what kind of a person is meant to live within it? You ever tried to keep up something that you have no investment in? A New Year's resolution that your spouse wrote for you? Try keeping up something that you did not actually personally invest in, and you know how hard that is. If you ever tried to break a bad habit, you know that willpower is not enough. It is never enough. This is why the gospel cannot be reduced to sin management and behavior modification. The goal of the kingdom is not, if you just keep saying no to what you really want and force yourself to do the right things, then you can win a ticket to heaven when you die. No, it's something better than that. It's about this time last year that I told you all that when I was a kid, I really wanted to be a preacher. And I cut my teeth on sermon outline books. And I still remember the sermon outline book that I picked up from, the 30s or 40s. And the title of the sermon was, Touch Not, Taste Not, Handle Not. That's a quote. That's a quote from Colossians chapter 2 and verse 21. And I don't remember the points, but it was something like, touch not a woman before you get married. Taste not alcohol. Handle not illicit drugs. It was something like that. Good advice. But I was shocked to my toes when I read this verse in a different translation. Listen to this. You died with Christ. Now the forces of the universe don't have any power over you. Why do you live as if you had to obey such rules as don't handle this, don't taste that, don't touch this? After these things are used, they are no longer good for anything. So why be bothered with the rules that humans have made up? Obeying these rules may seem to be smart. They appear to make you love God more and to be very humble and to have control over your own body, but they don't really have any power over our desires. Setting rules for yourself doesn't change what you want. It has no power to change what you love. The Christian religion is not something that can be reduced to sin management and behavior modification. It just makes you a totally miserable person, trying to live harder against every instinct in your body. It leaves you constantly aware of your failures with no power to be different. You remember the definition of insanity? Trying to do the same thing the same way and expecting a different result. Can I change that definition for just a second? It's insane to try to change what you do without having changed what you love. But what if you could adopt new things to love? You all know the passage in Galatians. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such there is no law. But I love the way Phillips adds this next line. Those who belong to Christ have crucified their old nature with everything that it loved. I want you to see the Sermon on the Mount as an invitation. It's why we're going to spend 3 months looking at it. It's an invitation to become a better you, a better version of you, a you you've never seen before. A you that's changed from the inside out, where your heart and your mind and your will are so utterly transformed that you can give in to the desires of your heart because the desires of your heart have changed. And doing right feels so natural because it's what you ultimately want. An invitation to live free from the domination of contempt and anger, of sexual lust, of the desire to manipulate and control other people. An invitation to live a life free from grudges, free from the constant need for fairness, free from the vicious downward spiral of payback and revenge. An invitation to become the kind of person who's able to love your enemies and bless those who curse you. The kind of person who doesn't perform for human credit. The kind of person who doesn't trust in money or food or clothing or see them as the answer to their most desperate needs. The kind of person who doesn't manage others, judge others, criticize others, compare themselves to others, but simply loves others for God's sake. And I think it'll have a profound difference on how we read the Sermon on the Mount, but even more so on how we put them into practice. Why do we turn the other cheek when someone hits us on this side? Why do we give without expecting in return? Why do we stay true to our word in every area of our lives? For the same reason that we don't kill our neighbors. Not because we have to tell ourselves to avoid our desires, but because our desires have been changed into love. In short, hear an invitation to form habits of the heart that lead to the eulogy virtues, to become the person you always wanted to be. We need new things to love. And we need a new community that shares our new loves. Welcome to the body of Christ. Welcome to the school of Christ. Christ, our master teacher, is calling for your heart and he'll take it, and he'll give it back to you, brand new.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you've been encouraged. I hope you've been enriched. And if you have any questions, any thoughts, any comments, reach out to us at prayers@wschurch.net. God bless you. Tune in next week.